On the night of 5th of December 1930, a large group of men in brown shirts descended on the Mozart Hall cinema in Berlin's Nollendorfplatz. Encouraged by the Nazis' chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, their mission was to see that evening's entertainment thrown off the screen. The Sturmabteilung, or more simply, the SA, were notorious for their violence, drunkenness and thuggery, and tonight was no exception. While Goebbels shouted, patrons were beaten, stink bombs thrown and white mice released. The film at the center of the mayhem was All Quiet on the Western Front, which was made in America the year before. It had been met with critical acclaim, even winning the Oscar for Best Production, equivalent to today's Best Picture. The book on which it was based sold over 1 million copies in its first year of publication in Germany alone. But its anti-war theme did not sit well with Nazi ideology. Both film and book became early casualties when the Nazis assumed power in 1933, culminating with the book being burned by students. Erich Maria Remarque's book is set in the trenches of the First World War. Although a novel, it is semi-autobiographical, as Remarque had served in the German army during the war. The book created controversy when it was published in 1929 because it depicted the war as harsh, and the violence senseless. Remarque did not paint the soldiers as heroic or especially honorable, which led many to see the book as critical of the German army, or outright anti-war. Although the book is set during the war, its focus is on the devastating effects of war on the soldiers who experienced it firsthand. It is not a historical narrative of events and battles, although the many references of shortages suggests most of it is set in the later years of the war. The story is told through the eyes of a young German soldier named Paul Baumer. At the beginning of the book, he has just turned 18. Like many German civilians in the first years of the war, Baumer and his friends are full of enthusiasm for the war. Erich Maria Remarque was conscripted into the German army in 1916. He had not long completed his training before he was sent to Flanders in 1917. In 1917, Germany's fortunes during the First World War were a mix of successes and significant challenges on both military and political fronts. The protracted and costly battles, including the events at Verdun and the Somme in 1916, took a heavy toll on the German army. Now, its forces were being gradually worn down by the relentless pressure from the Allied powers. At the outbreak of war in 1914, German war plans centered around a war of movement called the Schlieffen Plan. However, within weeks the plan stalled in the face of stiff opposition from the British and French allies. It quickly deteriorated into a brutal stalemate characterized by trench warfare. By 1917, the Allied forces launched offensives, such as the Battle of Passchendaele, which inflicted heavy losses on both sides without significant strategic gains. Germany was increasingly on the defensive. The Battle of Passchendaele was one of the most grueling and devastating battles of the First World War. Known for its unimaginable conditions, the relentless muddy landscape, and staggering loss of life, it is remembered as a symbol of the horrific cost of war. Under the command of British Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, the goal was to break through German defences and seize strategic points. But the ground around Passchendaele was poorly suited for such an offensive, and it was already saturated by weeks of relentless rain. The land around Passchendaele quickly became a nightmarish quagmire. Soldiers often sank knee-deep, and sometimes waist-deep, into mud and water. Conditions only worsened as heavy shelling churned the ground, turning it into a deadly swamp. The conditions on both sides were appalling. Soldiers fought in wet, freezing, and filthy trenches. Food and supplies often couldn't reach the front lines, leaving many without enough to eat or drink. Diseases like trench foot and dysentery were rampant. The conditions and senseless violence gave rise to Remarque's disillusionment and cynicism that permeated through his later writings. The fighting was intense, although little progress was made by either side. It was during one such engagement that Éric Maria Remarque was wounded by shrapnel from an artillery shell. Luckily, he was rescued from the battlefield by his comrades and taken to a field hospital. Also taking part in the battle, carrying messages back and forth, was a corporal who was to have a major impact on Remarque's life, Adolf Hitler. What was left of Passchendaele village was finally captured in November 1917. But victory came at an unimaginable cost. Over 500,000 men were either killed, wounded, or missing on both sides. The Allies advanced only 5 miles, gaining little strategic value. In response to the grinding attrition of trench warfare, Germany shifted towards a more defensive posture on the Western Front, by developing defense-in-depth tactics. Under the leadership of Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, Germany constructed the Hindenburg Line, a heavily fortified and deeply layered defense system. Instead of holding a rigid front line, the Germans introduced elastic defense, which allowed for a more flexible response to enemy offensives. The first line of defense was lightly held, while stronger reserves were stationed in the rear. If attacked, the front line could fall back, luring the enemy into prepared kill zones. Here, counterattacks and artillery fire could devastate advancing forces. The Hindenburg Line was built with multiple layers of trenches, barbed wire, and concrete bunkers. The idea was to make it difficult for Allied forces to achieve a breakthrough, even if they overran the first or second lines of defense. In early 1917, Germany conducted a strategic retreat to the Hindenburg Line, abandoning less defensible positions to shorten the front and free up troops for other sectors. This also forced the Allies to advance into devastated areas where supplies were scarce and infrastructure was destroyed. Towards the end of 1917, the Germans developed new offensive tactics that would have a major impact in the final year of the war. Stormtrooper tactics involved small, highly trained assault units tasked with infiltrating enemy lines rather than engaging in large frontal assaults. Artillery was used more selectively and intensively to create gaps in the enemy line, allowing the stormtroopers to exploit the breaches. The stormtroopers would bypass heavily defended positions and focus on weak points, penetrating deeply into enemy territory. Once the stormtroopers broke through, regular infantry would follow to consolidate gains. These tactics were first used in the Battle of Riga in September 1917 on the Eastern Front, and became central to the German spring offensives of 1918. On the Eastern Front, the German army enjoyed better fortune. By 1917, Russia was virtually out of the war. The Russian army had suffered severe losses in 1916, and internal unrest was brewing in Russia, which culminated in the Russian Revolution in 1917. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, Germany negotiated with the new Russian government to secure an armistice, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918. With Russia effectively out of the war, Germany was able to transfer troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front for a renewed effort in 1918, the Spring Offensive. While returning from leave, Paul Baumer sees for himself the misery of Russian prisoners of war. During the First World War, large numbers of Russian soldiers were captured and held as prisoners of war, mostly in Germany. Estimates put the number as high as 2.4 million. The conditions these Russian POWs experienced, as well as their treatment, varied over time and circumstances. POWs were housed in various camps throughout Germany. In All Quiet on the Western Front, there is a camp next to the army base he visits on his way back to the front. These camps ranged in quality, with some POWs suffering greatly due to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and lack of proper medical care. However, others were housed in better conditions, with the quality of life often depending on the location of the camp and the time of their capture. The shortage of food in Germany during the war was a significant issue, and it extended to the POWs. Russian prisoners were often given meager rations that led to malnutrition. The German war economy was under strain, and food shortages became increasingly severe from 1916 onward. Many Russian POWs were used as laborers to support the German war effort. They worked in agriculture, mines, and factories. In rural areas, POWs were sent to farms to assist with food production, particularly as more older German men were drafted into the military, to replace the huge losses of the first years of the conflict. In All Quiet on the Western Front, Erich Maria Remarque vividly depicts the wide array of weapons used during the First World War, emphasizing their devastating effects, physically and psychologically, on soldiers, and the dehumanizing nature of mechanized warfare. Any sense of heroism or glory is stripped away, replacing it with the cold mechanical slaughter of young men. The novel portrays the transition from traditional to mechanized warfare, highlighting how technological advancements make combat more brutal and impersonal. Human life is reduced to nothing more than numbers in the face of overwhelming mechanized destruction. The rifle and bayonet were the basic infantry weapons used by Paul Baumer and his comrades. He spares no detail when describing the brutal hand-to-hand combat. He describes how they are less than ideal for close quarters fighting in the confines of the trenches, as the rifles are long and the bayonet takes too long to kill an enemy. Despite the introduction of new weapons during the war, it's clubs and sharpened shovels that are preferred when attacking enemy trenches. Such weapons are in sharp contrast to the mechanized and impersonal means of killing endured by Baumer and his comrades. Artillery is one of the most lethal forces in the novel. Shellfire is a constant threat, creating a sense of inescapable danger. Remarque describes the massive explosions, and the way artillery shells pulverize soldiers, trenches, and the landscape. The psychological impact of artillery, including the deafening noise, constant bombardment, and the ever-present risk of being shelled, is a key aspect of the soldier's experience. Machine guns are a constant and terrifying presence in the novel. Capable of mowing down waves of advancing infantry, they symbolize the industrial scale of death in the First World War. Soldiers are often paralyzed by the fear of being caught in the relentless hail of bullets. The machine gun is portrayed as an emblem of the dehumanizing nature of modern warfare. Soldiers are killed in large numbers without the enemy needing to see them face to face. This mechanical efficiency in taking lives amplifies the novel's themes of the senselessness and brutality of war. The First World War also saw the introduction of totally new weapons. Tanks were first deployed by the British on the Somme in 1916. At first, they were not the war-winning weapon that many had hoped. Mechanical unreliability, and deep muddy terrain unsuited to this new form of warfare, led some commanders to question the tank's viability. But, during 1917, tactics and reliability were improved. They were to prove a decisive factor during the Allies' success at the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917. The northern French town of Cambrai was an important supply hub for the Germans' Hindenburg Line. It was hoped its capture would threaten the rear of their lines to the north. The assault relied on coordinating forces of tanks, infantry and artillery. The results on the first day were startlingly successful, but the Allies could not keep up the momentum. From the second day onwards, the Germans began pushing the British back as mechanical unreliability took its toll on the number of tanks available. Although the Germans were slow to see the tank's potential, they began using captured British and French machines while developing their own. Baumer describes tanks as a new and frightening presence on the battlefield. These mechanical beasts crush everything in their path, representing the increasing mechanization of warfare. The initial success of Cambrai was also helped by the use of close air support. Aircraft became increasingly useful as the war progressed. At the outbreak of war in 1914, aircraft were fragile machines capable of little more than providing reconnaissance. But developments came quickly, and soon aircraft were capable of carrying bombs, shooting each other down, spotting for the artillery as well as reconnaissance. Although aircraft have a minor role in all quiet on the Western Front, they symbolize the increasing detachment in war. Killing becomes more industrialized and impersonal. While the soldiers are stuck in the muck and the visceral human reality of trench warfare, the planes represent a kind of remote, distanced warfare, foretelling the future of combat. To Paul Baumer and his comrades, they are a source of dread. They will either come under accurate artillery fire or drop bombs on the trenches. Either way, soldiers in the trenches feel exposed and vulnerable even when they are not engaged in direct combat. The possibility of gas attacks also played on soldiers' fears. The Germans were the first to use gas in 1915. Later, both sides used artillery shells filled with gas. In all quiet on the Western Front, mustard gas is used, although other types of gas, like chlorine or phosgene, were also used. The novel vividly describes gas attacks as one of the terrifying and dehumanizing elements of trench warfare, contributing to the soldiers' constant sense of fear and vulnerability. Soldiers always had to be on alert for gas, which could be released at any moment. Gas masks became an essential piece of equipment, and the men constantly practiced donning them quickly to avoid inhaling the poison. The novel describes gas as a silent and invisible killer that causes agonizing deaths. If a soldier failed to put on a mask in time, or if the mask was faulty, the gas could burn their lungs and cause them to suffocate painfully. The fear of gas attacks adds another layer of psychological trauma to the soldier's experience. The unpredictability and suffering associated with gas made it one of the most feared weapons in the war, exacerbating the horrors of trench warfare. The novel depicts the devastating physical wounds soldiers endured, but it also emphasizes the deep psychological scars that lingered long after the fighting ended. During the First World War, the treatment of wounded German soldiers, like that of soldiers from other nations, reflected the medical challenges and limitations of the time. During the Battle of Passchendaele, Erich Maria Remarque was badly wounded by British artillery fire, like Paul Baumer. Remarque spent 18 months recovering from his wounds. Although he was sent back to the front, it was October 1918, and the war was all but over. If they could be reached, wounded soldiers received immediate care from fellow soldiers. First aid kits containing bandages, antiseptic powders, and tourniquets were standard issue. German medics were often close to the front lines, and they played a crucial role in stabilizing wounded soldiers before they could be evacuated. Dressing stations were located relatively close to the front lines, and provided initial medical care such as cleaning wounds, applying dressings, and administering basic pain relief. Field hospitals were mobile units that could be quickly established. They provided more comprehensive care, including surgeries for more serious injuries. Field hospitals were staffed by army doctors, nurses, and medical orderlies. Like in other armies, triage was used to prioritize treatment based on the severity of injuries. Soldiers with treatable wounds were given priority, while those with grave injuries were often given palliative care. German surgeons, like others in the war, made extensive use of antiseptics to clean wounds. However, infection was still a major cause of death due to the widespread use of machine guns, shrapnel, and high explosive artillery, which led to dirty, contaminated wounds. Soldiers with severe limb injuries were often treated with amputations. These procedures were common due to the limited medical options for reconstructive surgery or treating infected wounds. Advances were made in the development of prosthetics for amputees. The German government, like other nations, invested in designing functional prosthetic limbs, as many wounded soldiers had to return to civilian life with disabilities. Soldiers who survived initial treatment were sent to convalescent hospitals in Germany. These hospitals were often set up far from the front lines and focused on long-term recovery. Soldiers often felt disconnected from the world outside the front lines. Letters home took time, and information about the progress of the war was limited or controlled by propaganda. This sense of isolation, combined with the monotony of trench life, left soldiers mentally vulnerable. The daily threat of death or severe injury in the trenches created a constant state of fear. Many German soldiers were wounded or killed in large-scale battles like Verdun and the Somme. The unpredictability of combat meant that soldiers never knew if they would survive the next day, leading to a form of chronic anxiety. German soldiers, like their Allied counterparts, endured relentless artillery fire in the trenches. The unpredictable and devastating nature of artillery shells led to a state of hypervigilance and fear. Many German soldiers exhibited physical signs of shell shock, including tremors, paralysis, and inability to speak. In the early stages of the war, these symptoms were often misunderstood and seen as cowardice or malingering. A coping mechanism for many soldiers was emotional numbness or detachment, which was seen as a way to survive the constant exposure to trauma. Some soldiers reached a breaking point, resulting in mental breakdowns. Desertion was also a risk, though it was harshly punished by the German military. Living in trenches for extended periods was mentally and physically exhausting. The trenches were often cold, wet, and unsanitary, filled with mud, lice, rats, and the constant smell of death. The soldiers were also exposed to illnesses like trench fever and trench foot, which further worsened morale and mental health. Witnessing the deaths and severe injuries of friends and fellow soldiers could be a deeply traumatic experience. German soldiers often wrote about the helplessness and guilt they felt when they couldn't save others or had to continue fighting in the face of overwhelming loss. Germany was one of the first countries to use chemical weapons. Both the fear of being gassed and the horrific physical effects of gas attacks contributed significantly to psychological trauma. Treatment for combat stress in German military hospitals included rest, isolation from the front lines, and in some cases, experimental therapies such as electroshock treatment. However, these treatments were rudimentary by modern standards, and many soldiers never fully recovered. The soldiers' sense of isolation was sometimes exacerbated when leave was occasionally granted. The initial joy of seeing familiar faces and places could soon change to a feeling of alienation. Propaganda and newspaper reporting on the war were slanted in such a way that those on the home front had little or no idea of what their soldiers on the front line were going through. All too often the gulf between the soldiers' experiences and the lack of knowledge of their friends and families was too vast to bridge. For Paul Baumer, it is a profoundly depressing experience, leaving him wishing he had not come home. If there was one common experience then it was the lack of food. By 1917, Germany was experiencing severe food shortages due to the British naval blockade and the strain on agricultural production. The winter of 1916 to 1917, known as the Turnip Winter, saw a significant collapse in the food supply. People were forced to rely on turnips, a livestock feed, as their primary source of food, replacing even bread and potatoes, which were scarce. Malnutrition and starvation became common, leading to civil unrest and discontent with the government. Civilian morale was also suffering, and there was a general war weariness creeping into the civilian population. The initial patriotic fervor of 1914 had largely evaporated by 1917. The home front was demoralized by years of war, mounting casualties, and worsening living conditions. There was growing dissatisfaction with the German government, especially with the military leadership and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Many Germans questioned the purpose and conduct of the war, leading to anti-war protests and strikes. Financially, Germany was suffering. The war effort had severely disrupted the German economy. The production of consumer goods fell as resources were redirected toward military needs. Inflation surged, and wages stagnated. The government tried to address this by introducing rationing, but the system was poorly organized, exacerbating the shortages. As men were conscripted for the front lines, women took on many roles in factories and farms, but the increased demand for labor did not keep pace with needs. As a consequence of the shortages and growing opposition to the war, social tensions began to rise. There were strikes and rallies urging the government to seek an armistice. Many of Germany's problems in the latter years of the war were self-inflicted, as a consequence of adopting unrestricted submarine warfare. The aim was to try and starve the United Kingdom out of the war by sinking cargo ships carrying supplies bound for British ports. This strategy involved German U-boats attacking enemy and neutral ships without warning, a departure from previous international rules that required submarines to warn ships before attacking, allowing for the evacuation of civilians. Germany was aware that resuming unrestricted attacks might provoke the United States into joining the war. It was a gamble Germany's leaders was prepared to take, as they believed that even if the US entered, the impact would be minimal due to the time it would take for American forces to mobilize. The policy was initially successful. In the first few months, German submarines sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied and neutral shipping, severely disrupting the flow of supplies to Britain. However, the unrestricted attacks had a significant diplomatic and strategic cost. The sinking of American ships and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the US, inflamed American public opinion. On April 6, 1917, the US declared war on Germany, joining the Allied powers. This would eventually tilt the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. The entry of the US into the war significantly bolstered the Allied cause, providing fresh troops and economic resources that eventually helped secure victory. Although Remarque doesn't specifically mention the entry of the US into the war, the impact of the Americans' arrival is felt both in the trenches and on the home front. In the later stages, the soldiers are aware that something is happening, and that the war may be coming to an end. But still the fighting goes on. There is some relief for Baumer and his comrades when they are withdrawn from the front. They are to be inspected by Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. The issue of fresh uniforms lifts morale, but it is short-lived. Once the Kaiser leaves, they have to return the new uniforms. It leaves the soldiers with the uneasy feeling that they are being prepared for a major new offensive. By 1917, Germany and the Central Powers were exhausted by years of intense fighting. When the US joined the war, it brought a large influx of fresh troops, equipment, and financial resources to the Allied powers. The American Expeditionary Force, AEF, under General John J. Pershing began arriving in France in significant numbers by mid-1918, giving the Allies a critical manpower boost that Germany could not match. US entry decisively shifted the balance of power towards the Allies. German forces, already stretched thin, had been dealing with both the Western and Eastern fronts. Although Russia withdrew from the war, after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, the arrival of American forces more than offset any advantage Germany might have gained from that development. Germany knew time was running out as American troops and resources were arriving in Europe at an increasing rate. The German High Command, led by General Erich Ludendorff, devised a bold plan. A massive all-out attack to smash through Allied lines, divide British and French forces, and force a decisive victory before the full strength of American forces could arrive. The offensive began on March 21, 1918, with Operation Michael, the largest and most critical phase of the Spring Offensive. Germany unleashed an unprecedented artillery barrage along a 40-mile stretch of the British lines, near the Somme. This was followed by highly trained stormtroopers, elite German soldiers specializing in rapid focused attacks, designed to bypass strongpoints and penetrate deep behind enemy lines. In the first days of the offensive, German forces made rapid gains, pushing the British Fifth Army into retreat. The Germans advanced nearly 40 miles, the largest movement of the front since 1914. Morale soared as German troops captured key positions, artillery, and supplies, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though Ludendorff's gamble might pay off. But the initial successes of the spring offensive came at a high cost. German troops, pushing through the wreckage of the battlefield, outran their supply lines and became exhausted. Meanwhile, the Allies, under French General Ferdinand Foch, coordinated a unified response, shifting troops to plug gaps in their lines. American forces also began arriving in greater numbers, bringing fresh energy to the Allies. As the offensive wore on, Germany's initial momentum began to slow. Exhausted, undersupplied, and facing fierce Allied resistance, German troops could not maintain their advances. Subsequent attacks met with limited success. Despite fierce fighting, the Germans failed to achieve their primary objectives of splitting the British and French armies. By the summer of 1918, the tide had turned. The Allies, now reinforced by over 1 million American soldiers, launched a series of powerful counteroffensives. The Second Battle of the Marne in July was a decisive blow to Germany's hopes, as Allied forces pushed the Germans back and reclaimed lost ground. The Spring Offensive marked the last major German push of the First World War. While it inflicted heavy casualties on both sides, it failed to achieve a breakthrough, and the cost to Germany was catastrophic. Over 800,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the offensive, and the country was left militarily and economically exhausted. The 1918 Spring Offensive was Germany's last hope for victory. Though it started with dramatic gains, it ended in failure, sealing Germany's fate and paving the way for the Armistice and eventual Treaty of Versailles. The Spring Offensive demonstrated the brutal reality of modern warfare. Even the most daring plans could be undone by logistics, exhaustion, and the relentless arrival of new forces. After the failure of the Spring Offensive, the Allies, bolstered by American forces, launched a series of counterattacks that pushed German forces back, eventually forcing them into retreat. The 100 Days Offensive, which began in August 1918, marked the beginning of the end for Germany in the war. By October 1918, as Germany faced deteriorating conditions on the Western Front and escalating internal instability, German General Erich Ludendorff shifted his position on ending the war. Ludendorff, who had previously pushed for a continuation of hostilities, realized that Germany was in a dire situation, and that immediate action was necessary to prevent a total collapse. Years of blockade and war had left its people starving, industries in ruins, and morale shattered. With widespread strikes and civil unrest growing, the German government knew time was running out. The Allies, led by France, Britain, and the United States, agreed to consider Germany's request for an armistice. But their conditions were uncompromising. To avoid the collapse of Germany's government and society, German leaders hoped for a negotiated peace. What they faced instead were demands for unconditional surrender. This was a step too far for Ludendorff, although his frustration was to no avail. Soon after, however, he was pressured to stand down by the newly appointed government. Negotiators appealed directly to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, in the hope that his 14-point proposal would soften the demands of the French and British. In the novel and films based on the book, the soldiers sense that the end of the war is approaching. They have mixed emotions. What part, if anything, will they play in society when they return home? But for war-weary soldiers like Baumer, such thoughts are a distant reality. The fighting continues, for it is the only life they know. Death is still never far away. Even on seemingly quiet days, snipers were an ever-present threat. It is on just such a day that Remarque's hero meets his end, just weeks before the armistice is signed on the 11th of November, 1918. Although Paul Baumer is killed in the last weeks of the war, Eric Remarque did return home. But this was not a triumphant return. Instead, they came back to a nation that was deeply scarred, physically, emotionally, and politically. The soldiers returning home did so not as victors, but as a defeated army. Many had fought bravely, but the scale of the war, the toll of the British blockade, and the entry of the United States had made victory impossible. These men carried the heavy burden of knowing that despite their sacrifices, Germany had lost the war. When the soldiers finally made it home, they were greeted with mixed emotions. Many were welcomed by their families with open arms, relieved to have their loved ones back. But others returned to a nation in turmoil. Food shortages, political upheaval, and social unrest plagued post-war Germany. For the soldiers, it was clear that the country they had left behind was now very different. Germany itself was in chaos. The war's end had triggered political upheaval. Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated and fled the country, and a new republic, the Weimar Republic, was declared. Strikes, protests, and uprisings swept across the country. Returning soldiers found themselves caught in the middle of a nation in crisis. For many, the homecoming was not a return to peace, but to a country on the brink of civil war. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, placed full blame for the war on Germany, imposing harsh reparations and military restrictions. One of the treaty's primary goals was to drastically reduce Germany's military power. The German army was limited to only 100,000 men. Conscription was banned, meaning Germany could not draft soldiers, and all soldiers had to be volunteers. Germany was also forbidden from having tanks, heavy artillery, or an air force. These measures were intended to strip them of the ability to wage modern warfare. The navy was also restricted. Germany could keep only 6 battleships and a few smaller ships. Submarines, which had been a powerful weapon for Germany during the war, were completely banned. In addition to losing land and military power, Germany faced staggering financial penalties. The treaty demanded Germany accept full responsibility for the war, a clause known as the War Guilt Clause, and pay massive reparations to the Allies. These payments placed an enormous strain on Germany's already struggling economy, leading to inflation, unemployment, and widespread poverty. While the Treaty of Versailles aimed to secure peace, its harsh restrictions on Germany sowed the seeds of resentment and nationalism. In the years that followed, these unresolved tensions would contribute to the rise of Adolf Hitler and set the stage for the Second World War. In the years following the Armistice, a dangerous myth took root in Germany, the stab in the back myth. Many returning soldiers, unable to accept defeat, believed that the German military had not truly lost on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by politicians, communists, and Jews at home. This belief would have devastating consequences for Germany in the years to come. For the soldiers who had just returned home, the treaty felt like another blow, humiliating and unjust. Many veterans struggled to find work in the post-war economy, and poverty and disillusionment became widespread. Like many, Remarque struggled to find his place in Germany on his return home. As a soldier, he experienced the horrors of the Western Front firsthand, and those experiences would haunt him for the rest of his life. He eventually turned to writing. In 1929 he published his most famous book, All Quiet on the Western Front, or to use a direct translation from its original German, Nothing New in the West. The novel was an instant sensation, not just in Germany, but around the world. It sold millions of copies and was translated into dozens of languages, resonating with readers who had lived through the war or were grappling with its aftermath. But Remarque's success came at a price. By 1930, the Weimar Republic was failing. Although German industry was slowly recovering, the reparations, the money Germany had to pay to the Allies, were holding the economy back. Starvation and poverty were widespread. Following elections in September 1930, the Nazis made huge gains, becoming the second largest party in the German parliament. Party membership had also more than doubled. Joseph Goebbels was appointed their propaganda czar, and so began the process of eroding the last vestiges of German democracy. Any dissent was ruthlessly eradicated. Artists, writers and filmmakers were expected to follow the party line or face persecution. Thus, when the Nazis finally seized power in 1933, they saw all quiet on the Western Front as a threat. The novel's themes and film that followed were seen as defeatist and the soldiers unheroic. Its anti-war messages were at odds with the Nazi regime's militaristic and nationalist ideology. They viewed Remarque's depiction of German soldiers as victims of a pointless war as a betrayal of the fatherland. In May 1933, the Nazis targeted Remarque's works in the infamous book burnings, declaring them un-German. The novel was banned across Germany, and the Nazis launched a vicious propaganda campaign against him. The Nazi regime didn't stop with banning his book, they attacked Remarque personally. They falsely claimed that he had never fought in the war, calling him a liar and a coward. The Nazis even tried to discredit his family by suggesting he was of Jewish descent, a dangerous accusation under Hitler's regime. Fearing for his life, Remarque fled Germany in 1933, seeking refuge in Switzerland. From exile, he continued to write, but the pain of being branded a traitor in his homeland never left him. While his books remained banned in Nazi Germany, they continued to find success abroad, reminding the world of the horrors of war. The Nazi vendetta against Remarque took a tragic turn in 1943. His youngest sister, Elfriede Schultz, who had remained in Germany, was arrested by the Gestapo for anti-Nazi comments. In a brutal display of retribution, she was tried, convicted, and executed on the guillotine. Her crime, according to the judge, being the sister of Erich Maria Remarque. In the years after World War II, Remarque moved to the United States, where he continued his writing and became a vocal advocate for peace. The 1930 film adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front won 2 Academy Awards, bringing Remarque's message to an even wider audience. It remains one of the most influential anti-war films in history. A new version in 2022 included scenes featuring the difficult task faced by Matthias Erzberger in securing an armistice. He realized that Germany faced imminent defeat, and yet there were still generals who believed that Germany should fight on. The inclusion of Erzberger and his delegation underscores the inevitability of Germany's defeat, and the human cost of prolonging the conflict, represented by Paul Baumer's death. Today, Remarque's works continue to inspire readers around the world. His message about the futility of war and the shared humanity of soldiers on all sides resonates as strongly now as it did nearly a century ago. Though the Nazis tried to silence him, Remarque's voice has endured, reminding us of the terrible cost of war. Erich Maria Remarque's legacy is one of courage, resilience, and the power of the written word. In the face of censorship, persecution, and personal tragedy, he never stopped telling the truth about the horrors of war. His works remain a lasting testament to the fight for peace and the enduring strength of the human spirit.